4 years ago, my brother stole the love of my life, the woman I was about to propose to. Now, at our father's funeral, he walked in holding her hand and said, "We're so in love." I just smiled and said, "That's great. Aren't you upset?" He asked. "Not really. She told me she still loved me and hated you. She's just with you for the inheritance." He let go of her hand. "What?" "Yep. And I'm the executor of the will, and you get nothing." I, 32M, stood at the back of the funeral home, watching mourners file past my father's casket. The smell of lilies and furniture polish filled the air. I'd been there since dawn, greeting people I barely remembered, accepting condolences from distant relatives who hadn't bothered to visit when he was alive. My tie felt too tight. Everything felt too tight. For years. It had been 4 years since I'd seen my brother walk through my apartment door with her on his arm, both of them wearing guilty smiles that didn't quite reach their eyes. 4 years since the ring I'd saved 8 months to buy sat gathering dust in my desk drawer. For years since I'd learned that blood didn't always mean loyalty. The funeral home door opened again, and there they were. My brother walked in first, his hand clasped around hers. She looked different, thinner, with shorter hair and lines around her eyes that hadn't been there before. But it was definitely her. The woman I'd planned to propose to on her birthday. The woman I'd introduced to my family at Thanksgiving, who'd laughed at my father's terrible jokes and helped my mother wash dishes while the men watched football. The woman who'd been sleeping with my brother for 6 months before I found out. They approached slowly, scanning the room until my brother's eyes locked onto mine. I watched him lean down and whisper something to her. She nodded, her face pale. Then they walked straight toward me, weaving between clusters of black-suited mourners. My brother stopped 3 feet away. He looked older too, harder somehow. Success had been good to him. Expensive suit, designer watch, the kind of confidence that came from never facing real consequences. He told me they were sorry for my loss. Our loss, he corrected himself. Then he said it, standing there in front of our father's casket like he was commenting on the weather. He told me they were so in love. Really in love. That what they had was special, real, the kind of connection people spent their whole lives searching for. I just smiled. I told him that was great. The confusion on his face was immediate. He'd expected anger, tears, maybe even violence. We hadn't spoken since that day 4 years ago when I'd told him to get out of my apartment and never contact me again. He'd been sending emails for years, pathetic attempts at reconciliation that I deleted without reading. He'd probably built up this whole confrontation in his mind, rehearsed his lines, prepared his defenses. He asked if I wasn't upset. His voice carried a note of disappointment, like I'd stolen his moment. I told him not really. That's when I dropped it. I told him she'd reached out to me 6 months ago, that we'd been talking, that she'd confessed everything, how she'd made a mistake, how she still loved me, how being with him was the worst decision of her life. I watched her face drain of color as I spoke, her hand going limp in his grip. I told him she hated him, that she was only with him for one reason, the inheritance. His hand released hers like she'd burned him. He turned to face her, his voice rising as he demanded to know what I was talking about. People were starting to stare. My aunt paused mid-conversation, her eyes darting between us. I kept going. I told him it was true, that she knew Dad had made me the executor of his will, that I controlled everything now, the distributions, the timing, the allocations. That I'd seen the will last month when Dad asked me to witness the final revision. My brother's face went red. He asked what I meant by that. I smiled wider. I told him he got nothing. The word hung in the air between us. Nothing. Zero. Not the house, not the investments, not the business he'd assumed would be his. Nothing. His voice cracked as he asked what I meant. Surely Dad had left him something. He was family. Blood. I told him that apparently, stealing your brother's fiancée and bragging about it on social media was where Dad drew the line. That Dad had called me 8 months ago, asked me to come over, and spent 3 hours apologizing for not seeing what kind of man my brother really was. That he'd been planning to split everything evenly until he saw the Facebook posts, my brother and her, kissing at restaurants I'd taken her to, visiting places I'd talked about taking her, living the life I was supposed to have. None of this was entirely true, but my brother didn't know that. She tried to speak then, reaching for my brother's arm, but he jerked away from her. He asked her if it was true. His voice was shaking. I watched her face cycle through expressions, shock, fear, calculation. She was trying to figure out her next move, trying to determine which lie would serve her best. But my brother wasn't stupid, just arrogant. He could see the truth written across her features. She started to deny it, but I interrupted. I told my brother about the messages she'd sent me, how she'd said being with him was like being in prison, how she missed me, missed what we had, how she'd asked if there was any chance we could try again. I pulled out my phone and held it up. I asked if he wanted to see the screenshots. My brother's hands clenched into fists at his sides. He turned back to her, asked her if any of it was true. Just one thing. Any single thing. She looked at me, and I saw something flicker in her eyes. Not love. I'd been stupid enough to mistake that look for love once before. This was pure calculation. She was weighing her options, trying to figure out which brother was worth more to her now. She chose wrong. She told my brother I was lying, that I was jealous, vindictive, trying to drive them apart, that I'd never gotten over her, and this was my revenge. I shrugged and told them it didn't matter what they believed. The will would be read tomorrow morning at the lawyer's office. They were both welcome to attend. My brother asked what I meant by both. I told him that Dad had left her something in the will too. A special provision, added just 2 weeks before he died. $1. With a note that he hoped it would help her build the life of integrity and honesty she'd always claimed to value. That was the lie that broke him. My brother's face went purple. He started shouting about fairness, about blood, about how I'd poisoned Dad against him. Security started moving toward us. Other mourners were openly staring now, whispering behind their hands. She tried to pull him away, but he shook her off violently. He told her not to touch him. He asked her how much she'd known, how long she'd been playing him, whether anything between them had been real. She was crying now, mascara running down her cheeks. She insisted she loved him, that I was the liar, the manipulator, that I'd always been jealous of him, of his success, of how Dad had favored him. That last part almost made me laugh. Dad hadn't favored anyone. He'd been disappointed in both of us for different reasons. But he'd been especially disappointed after he learned what my brother had done. Security reached us then. They asked us to take it outside. This was a funeral home, they said. People were grieving. My brother jabbed a finger at my chest. He told me this wasn't over, that he'd contest the will, lawyer up, fight me for every penny. I told him he was welcome to try, but he should know that Dad had been very thorough. He'd had the will reviewed by 3 different attorneys, made sure it was ironclad. Dad had seen this coming, anticipated the fight. He'd even left a sealed letter explaining his reasoning, to be read in court if necessary. That was true, actually. The letter existed. I'd watched Dad write it, his hands shaking with age and anger. My brother stormed out, shoving through the crowd. She hesitated for just a moment, looking back at me. She asked if I really hated her that much. I told her I didn't hate her at all, that I'd actually thanked her in my own way. She'd shown me who my brother really was before I made him the best man at my wedding, before I had kids that would have called him uncle. She'd done me a favor. Then I asked if she was going to chase after him. She looked toward the door where my brother had disappeared, then back at me. She asked what was really in the will. I smiled and told her she'd find out tomorrow. The reading was at 9. She left without another word. My mother appeared at my elbow, asked what had happened. I told her nothing important, just old wounds. She patted my arm and said she was proud of how I'd handled it. That Dad would have been proud too. The funeral ended an hour later. I stood beside the casket as they closed it, said my private goodbye to the old man who'd called me 3 months ago to apologize for not seeing through my brother sooner, who'd told me he was changing his will, that he wanted to make things right, who'd asked if I was seeing anyone, if I was happy, if I'd managed to move on. I had moved on. It had taken 2 years of therapy and a lot of work, but I'd rebuilt my life. I had a good job, good friends, a small apartment I actually liked. I'd dated, though nothing serious. The trust didn't come easy anymore. But my brother didn't know any of that. He'd been too busy posting pictures of his perfect life to notice mine. Update 1. The lawyer's office was on the 7th floor of a glass building downtown. I arrived 15 minutes early and waited in the lobby, drinking burnt coffee from a paper cup. The lawyer, a woman in her 50s with steel gray hair and sharp eyes, greeted me warmly. She told me she'd handled my father's affairs for 20 years, that he was a good man who'd been clear about his intentions. My brother showed up at 8:58, alone. His eyes were bloodshot, his tie crooked. He looked like he'd been up all night. He didn't acknowledge me, just walked past and took a seat on the opposite side of the conference room. She didn't come. I wasn't surprised. The reading took 20 minutes. The lawyer went through it line by line, her voice steady and professional. The reality was different from what I'd told my brother, but not by much. Dad had split the estate 60-40. 60% to me, 40% to my brother. But there were conditions on my brother's share. He couldn't access it for 5 years. It would be held in trust, managed by me as executor. He'd receive monthly allowances, but the bulk of it was locked away. If he contested the will, he'd forfeit everything. The lawyer read Dad's letter then. He wrote that he loved both his sons, but he couldn't reward the behavior he'd seen from the younger one. That betrayal of family trust was the one thing he couldn't forgive. That 5 years in trust would give my brother time to reflect on the kind of man he wanted to be. That he hoped, in 5 years, they'd both be better men than they were today. My brother sat frozen, his face unreadable. There was nothing in the will about her. I'd made that up entirely. The lawyer finished reading and set the papers down. She asked if there were any questions. My brother asked if it was real, if Dad had really done this. The lawyer confirmed it. She showed him the signatures, the witness statements, the date stamps. Everything was legal and binding. My brother turned to me. He asked why I'd lied about the will. About her. I told him I wanted him to feel what I'd felt 4 years ago. The betrayal. The humiliation. The sudden realization that someone you loved and trusted had been playing you all along. I told him I wanted him to look at her and wonder if anything between them was real. To question every moment, every word, every kiss. To feel the ground disappear beneath his feet. He said nothing for a long moment. Then he asked if she'd really reached out to me. I told him no. I'd lied about that too. I hadn't heard from her in 4 years. But he'd never know for sure, would he? That doubt would sit in his mind forever, poisoning everything. Every time she looked at her phone, every time she was quiet, every time she seemed distant, he'd wonder. He'd question. He'd doubt. Just like I had. The lawyer cleared her throat and suggested we take a break. That emotions were high, and perhaps we all needed time to process. My brother stood up. He told me I'd won. That I'd gotten my revenge. That I should be happy. I told him I wasn't happy. That this whole thing made me sad. But it made us even. He left without another word. Update 2. That was 3 weeks ago. I heard through family that my brother and she broke up 2 days after the will reading. She moved out of his apartment and back to her hometown. He didn't try to stop her. My mother called to check on me. She asked if I felt better now that it was done. I told her I felt tired. That revenge wasn't as satisfying as people claimed it would be. She said Dad would have been proud anyway. That standing up for yourself was important, even when it hurt. I signed the final estate papers yesterday. My brother's trust is established. He'll get his first monthly payment next week. Enough to live comfortably, but not enough to be reckless. In 5 years, if he doesn't contest anything, he'll get the rest. I don't know if he will. We haven't spoken since that day in the lawyer's office. I drove past our father's house this morning. There's a for sale sign in the yard now. Neither of us wanted to keep it. Too many memories, good and bad. The money from the sale will be split according to the will's terms. I sat in my car across the street for 20 minutes, remembering Sunday dinners and backyard barbecues and the Christmas Dad dressed as Santa even though we were way too old to believe. Remembering when my brother and I were close, before careers and jealousy and her came between us. My phone buzzed. A message from an unknown number. It was her. She said she heard what really happened with the will. That my brother had told her everything before they split. She said she didn't blame me for lying, that she probably deserved it, that she'd made terrible choices and hurt people she cared about. She said she hoped I was doing okay, that she'd always remember the good times we had, that she was sorry for everything. I stared at the message for a long time. My thumb hovered over the reply button. Then I deleted it and blocked the number. Some chapters need to stay closed. I started the car and drove away from my father's house, away from that neighborhood, away from the past. Tomorrow I'm meeting a friend for coffee. Next week I'm starting a new project at work. Next month I'm planning a trip to Colorado, somewhere I've always wanted to visit. The inheritance will help with that. And the therapy I'm going to continue. And building a life that isn't defined by what was taken from me. My brother took something from me 4 years ago, but I took something from him too. His certainty, his trust, his peace of mind. We're even now. Whether that makes me a good person or a bad one, I honestly don't know. But it makes me human. Flawed and petty and capable of hurting people who hurt me. I can live with that. Dad would have understood. He wasn't perfect either. None of us are. I just hope 5 years from now, my brother and I can find some way back to being family again. Not the way we were. That's gone forever. But something new, something honest. Maybe that's the real inheritance Dad left us. Not money or houses or businesses, but time. Time to heal. Time to grow. Time to become better versions of ourselves. I guess we'll see.